In the age when stars bled and prayers burned against the void, the Emperor of mankind sat upon the golden throne, his flesh long since conquered by decay, while his mind ranged wider than fleets and empires. Within the lightless ocean, men called the warp, where thought had weight and fear, war fangs he kept a beacon alive by sheer refusal. Ships crossed gulfs because he would not allow the light to die. Worlds endured because he would not permit them to fall. For 10,000 years, this had been his answer to the darkness. On a day like any other in eternity, the Astronomicon faltered for the span of a single heartbeat. Choirs of psychers screamed as one, incense hissed across sanctuaries, servo bells stuttered. No demonic tide pressed upon the ramparts, and no god of madness rose from the depths. Instead, there came a ripple like a question, and its shape was not hatred. It carried no stench of worship and no magnetic pull of despair. It felt to the Emperor's immeasurable senses, like a movement without malice and a will without creed, raw intent unshaped by dogma. He turned the totality of his still surviving will toward that fracture. Where lesser minds would have drowned, he leaned. The warp bent. From the citadel of his thought, he cut loose a fragment of essence, honed it to a single purpose, and clothed it in an image gentle enough to touch another reality without tearing it. The shard did not travel as a craft travels, nor pass as a pilgrim passes. It exhaled itself from one truth and condensed upon another, as dew collects upon the first blade of morning grass. In the universe, he touched energy, did not think. It breathed. Men and gods shaped their power with motion and discipline rather than prayer. There above a blue world, a second sun unfurled. It emitted no heat and cast no shadow. It simply existed, a sphere of gold that brightened the pale edges of clouds and washed the seas in patient light. Birds changed their flight to meet it. Children on city rooftops lifted their hands as if they could catch it. Dogs fell silent, puzzled by a light that did not burn their eyes. The wise and the violent paused alike. Monasteries felt it first. In a temple whose stones had memorized centuries of silence, a monk raised his head from meditation and realized the room had become wider, as if some unseen wall had drawn back to let in more sky. He thought of names for the feeling and found none. On a windswept plateau, a hermit whose fists could shatter mountains lowered them and listened not with ears, but with the old bright place behind the heart. He could not measure the light, and therefore accepted it. In towers of metal and glass, instruments chimed without finding anything to report. The screens did not know how to convey the presence of a thing that had no mass, and yet filled horizons. Researchers recorded numbers that changed nothing, and after a while simply stared through their windows. Across the quiet halls of the Angel's Whis regarded the golden bloom, his staff reflecting it, as if the crystal held a private dawn. His eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in curiosity. The light did not slot into the order of things he stewarded, and that delighted him more than it worried him. Beside him, Beerus uncurled from a nap that had lasted just long enough to forget the taste of boredom. The god of destruction disliked the sensation that came next. It was not fear, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that here was a calm he had not authored. Another star, he said, annoyed at how mortal the words sounded on his tongue. Wiz tapped the staff lightly against the ground, because one did not smile too broadly when the cosmos surprised him. A visitor. On earth, far from palaces and titles, a man with a scarless heart looked up from his training. The air had shifted. He felt it not as a challenge, but as the end of a question he had been asking his whole life, without knowing he had asked it. The light above contained no threat, no promise of a fight. And yet, it called to the same part of him that fights had always woken. He shaded his eyes with one hand and laughed softly, the unguarded sound of a child who has found a new hill to climb. Elsewhere on that planet, a warrior who had worn pride like armor stared hard into the sky and forced himself to say nothing. He would not ask what the second son wanted. He would not dignify it with curiosity. But after a time, his clenched jaw loosened because the light did not ask to be measured, and there is a relief in what refuses to explain itself. Across oceans and into mountains, the light continued. It lay in rivers like a coin of pure gold, and it threaded forests where the leaves accepted it without opinion. It did not change the temperature of the world or the pull of its tides. It changed only the willingness of the living to pause. The projection the Emperor had launched into that place took shape within the second sun, not by choosing a shape, but by consenting to the shapes others needed. To the farmer, it looked like a guardian. Drawn from old stories the farmer no longer believed. To the monk, it was a patient flame held in cupped hands. To the fighters, whose bodies remembered every strike they had ever thrown, it was an outline of a man in armor made of noon. All of these were true, because in a world where power obeyed instinct, truth could be many garments draped over the same intent. He did not speak. Words would have been a kind of gravity, and he did not wish to bend anything that had not chosen to be bent. He simply watched. The watching itself sent another pulse, and its wake moved through the universe the way a kind thought moves through a crowded room, not forcing a path, yet finding one. Even in the palace, where the childlike sovereign presided over scales too large for history, attention flicked toward the unfamiliar dawn. Zeno did not dislike the light. He simply did not recognize it, and that realization was more novel to him than the light itself. The courtyard grew very still. The attendants waited. The grand priest found no metric that mattered, and lowered his hand. Back in the Imperium, the source of all storms, the Emperor measured as only he could. He tasted the fabric of this other reality and found no blade in it. It was not safe. Nothing living could be called safe, but it was not designed to devour. Here struggle had purpose beyond appetite. Here destruction had a job and did not ask for a throne. The will that animated the warriors of this realm reached outward rather than downward. It did not kneel before ideas. It stood beside them. He felt the relief of a man who has always been braced against a blow and for once is not struck. On Terra, the attendants of the throne knew only that a minute's worth of sacrifice lasted a second longer than usual. Candles guttered and recovered. A tech adept, staring at lines of data, blinked, certain he had seen the numbers bow. Somewhere on Mars, a choir fell silent of its own accord and then resumed the hymn without acknowledging that silence. The traces were small, like the footprints of a night animal seen in ash at dawn. The shard of the Emperor's will floated within the second sun and learned. He watched a fisherman set down his net and shade his eyes. He watched a toddler abandon a tantrum to point upward with complete sovereignty. He watched a company of fighters rehearse their forms more slowly than usual because their bodies understood something about pace that their minds had not yet caught. He watched a scientist remove her glasses for the first time in a year and simply look. The light did not make any of these beings better than they had been the day before. It only gave permission to imagine that something other than power might be watching. In the Emperor's long war, faith had been a weapon and a shield and a leash. In this realm, faith had not been needed to make power work. He wondered whether that absence was a wound or a mercy. He wondered whether a people who did not require belief for their strength might be more honest. He wondered what would happen if they learned to believe in something anyway. The thought opened like a gate, and the shard brightened. It was not a declaration. It was a courtesy. The light announced that it would remain for a while, and the world below accepted that, as one accepts weather. The ocean made a single larger wave and then returned to itself. It was noted how the glow interfered with nothing and altered everything. He appreciated such paradoxes. A consciousness that chooses to be gentle, he said more to the universe than to any companion. Rare. Beerus did not answer. He was busy examining the shape of the unease and naming it. It resembled the discomfort of finding a sword in one's scabbard that one did not put there. Not a threat, a reminder. On a grassy cliff, Goku tilted his head and let instincts become quiet. He searched the light for the familiar prickle that precedes danger. There was none. What remained was a feeling he did not know how to distrust. He set his feet and breathed and allowed the world to be large. "Guess I'll see what you've got," he said, not to taunt and not to vow, but because promise sounds like that when it first wakes. The second sun pulsed not as an answer, but as a mirror. Far away, yet intimately near the Emperor, realigned the edges of his projection so that no living will would snag upon them. He remembered a field of ancient grass and a sky where storms learned to be storms by watching him cross them. He remembered because remembering is a way of staying kind. For 10 millennia, he had held a light steady for a species that had mistaken survival for destiny. He had shaped laws until they wore grooves into souls. Here in this other place, he entertained the treasonous idea that order might not be a cage if one learned to open it from the inside. He did not erase his doubts. He set them alongside the light and observed their shapes. A name was not necessary, but the universe favors names because names let love find its target. Minds below began to speak of the second sun, and as language touches anything, it edits it. The phrase earned weight in the air around it. People tried it in their mouths and decided it tasted like hope, though they would not have used that word. Sailors used it to mark a course. Pilots treated it as an unlisted star and logged it with an asterisk. Grandmothers told children it was a story and then stopped mid-sentence as the children fell asleep faster than usual, as if the light had tired them very gently. When night came to half the world, the second sun did not set. It dimmed until it resembled a coin caught under water, then resumed its brightness for those who still had day. It refused to be counted as an hour. The world reorganized its shadows around that refusal, and nothing broke. In the palaces between universes, Zeno watched for a while longer, and then chose with the equanimity of a child who has discovered a new toy and decided not to break it yet, to keep watching. The Grand Priest folded a question into the fabric of his robe for later. Gods of other stations paused in their errands and honored the light the way one honors a stranger, by not asking immediate questions. Within the second sun, the Emperor let a thought cross the quiet, like a bird crossing a lake. It was not meant for any single person. It was meant for the habit that binds multitudes. I will not take from you, the thought implied. I will not demand that you rename yourselves to please me. I will not braid your power into mine and call the rope mercy. I have come to see how a will behaves when it is not hunted. The universe did not reply because universes do not owe explanations. But individuals did what individuals always do. One fighter resumed a kata with a small improvement he could not have invented yesterday. A mother forgave herself for being tired. A scientist took one more measurement, even though the last 100 had failed her. A man who had sworn never to fight again went outside and practiced a single punch very slowly until his hands remembered. A child dreamed of standing on the sea and woke with dry feet but wet eyes. On Terra, a custodian assigned to a corridor no visitor would ever walk stood a fraction straighter without knowing why. In the dark, inside the dark, a machine spirit ran colder and more efficiently for an hour. Somewhere, a heretic remembered a childhood prayer and did not say it, and that abstention registered as a kindness. The Emperor did not rejoice. He marked. He is a man who carries victories like stones rather than banners. The second sun remained unembarrassed by its own simplicity. The absence of heat became a kind of lesson. This was illumination without conquest. The world below, designed for force, experimented for a day with gentleness and found it did not dull the blade. Toward evening, in one hemisphere, Goku sat cross-legged and regarded the light as he might regard a friend he had not met yet. The breeze made the grass lean toward the glow. He did not perform. He did not ask the sky to answer him. He only paid attention with such devotion that attention became its own kind of power. The Emperor felt that attention travel up the bridge between realities and smiled in the only way he could now, which is to drop a weight he has carried and notice that he is not shorter without it. The shard brightened once more, not to announce an arrival, but to take a shape the man below could meet. A human outline formed within the light armor suggested, rather than worn a crown implied, rather than displayed. No banner, no oath. The figure did not descend. The world would have to choose to reach up. Across cities and deserts, the day folded itself toward night. Lamps were lit for reasons that had nothing to do with darkness. A teacher dismissed a class early because silence had already taught what he could not. A fighter poured tea for an old rival who happened to pass his gate. Someone who had sworn vengeance went to sleep before planning the next step. Police whistles blew a little less often. Hospital monitors beeped a little more softly. None of this would last forever. None of it needed to. Was watching thought about faith in a universe that does not require it. He understood discipline and balanced the mathematics of destruction and creation. He did not often consider belief. Yet the golden light made him imagine a world where belief was not a lever, but a lantern. His smile this time felt like a secret he might keep for the pleasure of keeping it. Beerus finally found language precise enough to file the sensation respect. He did not appreciate being surprised. He respected the manner in which he had been surprised. On the golden throne, the Emperor's body made no motion that a mortal could name. In the soul's geography, he moved a great distance. Curiosity, long chained and starved, sat down beside duty, and the two of them shared a bowl. If any of the attendants had had the senses to perceive it, they might have said the room became bigger by the width of a single breath. The second sun held steady. The projection held its shape because shape is a kind of courtesy. Goku closed his eyes and let the world climb him like a vine until his thoughts were small. He stood bowed to no one and everyone and lifted into the air. He would go higher tomorrow. For tonight, he would let the light be what it was, a promise that had not chosen its wording yet. High above the figure of gold did not beckon. It did not need to. The horizon learned a new syllable and taught it to the sea. Mountains adjusted by a hair's width the story they believed about themselves. Somewhere in the deep places between realities, older hungers rolled over and went back to sleep, bored by the absence of fear. The Emperor watched until the watching itself became a kind of rest. He did not name the place he had found, because names claim. He did not claim. He remembered what he had learned and let the memory move through him like clean water through old pipes. Far away, the beacon that guided his people burned a fraction steadier as if steadiness were contagious when finally seen and not merely demanded. Night came and did not dare extinguish the second sun. It only dimmed around it, learning manners. The world turned. The light stayed. The man on the throne continued to die and continued to refuse. And somewhere a version of him, not required for refusal, softly wondered what a will might become when it is allowed to be curious for longer than a moment. The second sun endured. Days passed, though time around the light seemed reluctant to move forward, as if it feared to disturb something newly sacred. It hovered above the blue world, with no orbit and no logic, unshaken by the pull of gravity or the complaints of science. It neither rose nor set. Yet, night continued to exist, folding itself humbly around the edges of its golden dominion. Across earth and through the heavens, mortals and gods alike began to accept the anomaly as one accepts a truth that resists analysis. It did not demand worship. It demanded attention. Attention, as every god and philosopher knows, is the first form of prayer. The emperor's projection lingered within the heart of the second sun. What he had sent was not his soul, nor even a fragment of it, but something more abstract, the memory of a will that refused extinction. It hovered like a candle burning inside another flame, a light so still it bent perception around it. He observed this new realm and found it bewildering in its simplicity. In his own universe, faith and fear had become indistinguishable twins. Here beings fought, died, and rose again with the patience of seasons. They destroyed because destruction was a rhythm, not a philosophy. Even their gods, these Hakaishin and Kaioshin, did not demand eternal allegiance. They presided, they corrected, they rested. No choir sang to them. No empire trembled at their names. In such a place, he wondered what need was there for faith at all. Below on earth, one man could not stop staring at the new light. Son Goku had lived through apocalypse, resurrection, and the kind of power that bends reality until it hums. Yet this silent brilliance felt different. There was no battle to chase, no tournament to win. It offered him nothing, and somehow that made him restless. He wanted to meet it, not to test it, but to understand the feeling it stirred in him, that there might be something stronger than strength itself. He rose from his mountain home one morning, leaving behind the still warm bowl of rice and the echo of a wife's voice calling him back. He smiled a little sheepish, knowing she would understand. She always did. Then, with a breath that cracked the clouds, he soared upward. The higher he flew, the quieter the world became. Layers of air surrendered to the vacuum, sound drained away, and still the golden radiance grew sharper. His aura flickered instinctively, matching the frequency of the light before him, as if trying to greet it in its own language. There beyond the thin blue line of atmosphere, the second sun filled his vision. It was not a star. It was a door made of light. He hesitated. "If you're alive," he said softly, "you can hear me, right?" The light shimmered not in response, but as though considering the concept of being addressed. Then came a voice not external, not even within the mind, but somewhere between the two. All living things can be heard. Few are listened to. Goku's breath caught. It was not a sound he heard. It was understanding delivered directly into awareness, heavy and calm. "So you are alive," he whispered. "Alive," the presence repeated, tasting the word through him. "If persistence is life, then yes, I am persistence." The space around him rippled like the surface of a lake struck by a single drop. From within the radiance, a form began to take shape, human, yet immense, defined not by muscle or matter, but by certainty. A figure of gold taller than mountains yet, contained within a man's outline, faced him. Goku steadied himself, arms crossed loosely, eyes bright with curiosity. "You don't feel like any god I've met. I am not your god." The words came without movement, carried on the rhythm of being itself. "Nor am I a god to my own people. They made me one because they forgot what I was." Goku tilted his head. "And what was that necessary?" The answer hung between them, like the last note of a great bell. For a long while, neither spoke. Then the light around the Emperor shifted, focusing, not threatening, but searching. The projection was learning. The raw instinct of this fighter before him, this mortal who had achieved the power of angels by sheer will, fascinated him. Here was a being whose strength had never required worship or empire. Here was what humanity might have been, had it never built a throne. "Why are you here?" Goku asked at last. "To see what freedom looks like." The simplicity of the answer unsettled him. Freedom was not a thing Goku often defined. He simply lived it. But hearing it spoken in a voice that carried the gravity of galaxies made it sound fragile, almost sacred. "Freedom's easy," he said, smiling faintly. "You just do what you think's right. You don't need to overthink it." And yet the Emperor replied, so many fall when left to that choice. "Yeah," Goku admitted. "But we get back up." The projection studied him in silence. In that small exchange, he recognized something long forgotten, the possibility of order without chains. For millennia, he had fought to save humanity from itself, building a cage of light to keep chaos at bay. But perhaps this universe had found another balance, a harmony between instinct and purpose that required neither obedience nor despair. Below them, the blue planet turned slowly, unbothered by the meeting of two impossibilities. Far away, Whis stood upon a distant ridge of space-time, staff poised, as if measuring the conversation. The energy signatures twisted in ways he could barely catalog. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Two philosophies pretending to be men." Beerus hovered beside him, arms folded, tail flicking. "If that thing tries anything, I'll erase it." Whis smiled without looking away. "Would you? You might discover it's already beyond erasure." Back in orbit, Goku felt a tingle in his skin, the sensation of power brushing against something immeasurable. "You're strong," he said, grinning again. "Really strong." "Strength is an echo," the Emperor answered. "It exists only because weakness remembers it." Goku blinked, then laughed. "You talk funny." "So I have been told." The light softened, dimming to the color of sunrise. It no longer blinded him. It invited him closer. The Emperor extended no hand yet. Goku felt a pull, gentle, patient, inevitable. He moved forward through the golden haze until the world vanished behind him. Within the second sun, time behaved differently. What had been light became a landscape of shifting radiance, forms of memory made visible. Goku walked, or perhaps floated through visions of worlds he did not know. Endless cities burning beneath banners, armies marching under skies full of thunder, and a golden figure enthroned amid machinery the size of continents. Everywhere he looked, he saw devotion carved into steel and bone. He frowned. "This is your world, isn't it? My burden," the Emperor said. "A paradise built from fear of the dark. It endures because it must not, because it should." Goku turned to face him. "You don't sound like you're proud of it." "I am not proud. I am responsible. Responsibility." The word tasted bitter even across universes. He had ruled so long that the act of command had become his existence. Yet here was a man who sought no rule at all, who measured his worth not by control, but by effort. Perhaps the Emperor thought freedom was not chaos, it was trust. "You came all this way," Goku said quietly. "So what are you looking for, proof?" "Of what? That mankind, any kind, can be strong without me." The honesty of it stilled even Goku. The air shimmered around them as the projection began to destabilize slightly. Crossing realities consumed even divine will. He sensed the fragility of the bridge between worlds and the cost of holding it. Goku's instinct sharpened. "Hey, you're fading. This form was never meant to last." "But I have seen enough." A pause like a breath of a star. "You live in a universe where power does not demand belief. Guard that carefully. One day, you may learn that belief itself is another kind of strength." Goku wanted to reply to ask the 1,000 questions blooming in his mind, but the light was already dimming, folding itself back into the golden core. The voice came one last time, softer now, like memory descending into sleep. "Until we meet again, warrior of instinct." The second sun pulsed once more, and Goku found himself alone above the curve of the earth, the golden light returning to its calm, steady brilliance. He hovered in silence, heart pounding not from battle, but from revelation. Somewhere deep inside him, a seed had been planted. An awareness that strength could serve something beyond victory. He turned back toward home, a thin smile on his face. The world awaited, and so did questions without answers. Far across the void in the silent halls of the Golden Throne, the Emperor's mind settled into its old confines. The warp roared around him, but something within had changed. Curiosity had survived the journey. Hope and emotion he had long declared inefficient whispered like a trespasser at the edge of his consciousness. He did not banish it. He simply let it stay. The silence around the throne shifted. Choirs continued their chants, unaware that the universe had entered the Emperor's thoughts and refused to leave. In the edges of his vision, the Emperor saw afterimages, a fighter laughing at the face of divinity, a world that thrived without prayer. It was intolerable and beautiful. He considered for the first time in centuries that ignorance might not be weakness, but protection. He searched the warp for echoes of that other realm. Nothing. The bridge had collapsed behind him, and that was right. Bridges should not stay open forever. But through the cracks in eternity, he felt warmth, faint and persistent, like sunlight filtering through the walls of a tomb. It comforted him in ways the adoration of billions never had. Far beyond in the quiet heavens, of Universe 7, Whiz turned to Beerus, who still glared toward the faint glow. "Did you feel that?" Whiz asked. Beerus grunted. "Feel what?" The silence after a lesson. Beerus scowled, feigning indifference. "You talk like the monks on that little planet." Perhaps Whis said, eyes half closed, but I suspect the lesson was not meant for us. On Earth, Goku descended slowly, clouds parting around him. The second sun remained where it had been, unchanging and patient. When he landed, Chi-Chi stood on the porch, hands on her hips. "Another training trip?" she asked, half scolding, half concerned. He scratched the back of his head, embarrassed. "Not exactly. I met someone, I think." She frowned. "You think Goku looked up at the sky where the strange sun shone?" Hard to explain. It wasn't a fight, more like... He paused, searching for the right word. A conversation. Chi-Chi sighed and shook her head, muttering something about impossible husbands. Yet when she followed his gaze, her voice softened. "Whatever that thing is, you'd better not bring it home." He laughed. "Don't worry. I think it came to learn not to stay. That night, as the world turned and the second sun dimmed just enough to allow stars to breathe, the Emperor sat motionless upon his throne, the faint echo of a mortal's laughter threading through his mind. He did not understand it, and perhaps that was why it mattered. The second sun remained unchanging. Weeks passed, then months, and yet its radiance neither dimmed nor intensified. It simply was a patient constant above a restless world. Mortals adapted in the way they always do. They stopped asking why. Farmers worked beneath the doubled light. Scientists wrote papers that explained nothing, and prophets learned the humility of silence. But among the gods, unease lingered. The heavens dislike mysteries that refuse hierarchy. Was observed the phenomenon each day, adjusting the staff that served as both instrument and anchor. The readings defied even divine mathematics. The light was not energy. It was decision crystallized and visible. A note of quiet threaded his expression as he watched the gold sphere hold its vigil. He measured angles that would not remain angles, lengths that refused to stay measurable, and came at last to the only conclusion worthy of a universe. Something was watching and choosing not to act. Bira, sprawled on a stone platform, cracked one golden eye. To him, the second sun tasted like a memory from before he began counting. He disliked the sensation. It felt like being placed within a story not of his own making. He told himself that an observer without claws was harmless and heard the hollowness of the thought. A patient watcher can be more dangerous than an impatient conqueror. Within the light, the Emperor's projection endured. He had learned more of this universe by stillness than he ever did through conquest. Yet his patience carried a flaw, a whisper of the general. He had been the architect of unification and war. The habit of command persisted like the ache of an old wound. He did not order. He intended. Through that smallest opening, the warp stirred. Faint echoes of chaos crept across his awareness like cold air under a door. No breach, no invasion, only curiosity sharpened into appetite. They tasted the scent of a cosmos not written in their grammar, and pressed their faces to the glass of reality. The Emperor drew his projection closer around this realm, instinctively interposing will. The act was subtle, a single additional thread woven into the tapestry. Yet in doing so, he disturbed the perfect stillness he had crafted. Whis felt the tremor instantly, a vibration that did not belong. Beerus sat up, ears flicking the primate alertness inside the god, roused by the soundless click of a trap that may or may not exist. They glanced at one another and did not pretend this was nothing. On Earth, Goku woke in darkness, the room quiet, the house steady around him. He had dreamed of a lake without shore and a flame that learned to float. The dream's light continued beyond sleep, a pressure behind the sternum, gentle as a hand upon a door that patient knuckles tap only once. He rose, stepped outside, and found the night textured with gold. The second sun was fuller, as if breathing. He lifted into the sky with the ease of remembering. The higher he went, the thinner sound became, until even his own heartbeat seemed to ask permission before continuing. Space received him with the indifference of a desert. The golden sphere received him with the courtesy of a host. The Emperor was waiting calm as a held note. You feel it, the voice conveyed no vibration, only recognition placed where hearing should be. Goku nodded. Something's moving. The reply arrived with equal simplicity. The warp reacts to will, and mine will not remain quiet. The light quivered, folding upon itself. Within its core shadow accumulated not darkness as absence, but darkness as ink, a medium that records. Threads of umbra coiled and uncoiled, writing the oldest arguments across emptiness, order, and freedom, law, and life. The warp did not enter this universe. It mirrored itself through him. Every certainty and doubt he carried from his own eternity echoed here, and the echo made weather. He tried to still it. For 10,000 years he had mastered silence, yet silence now disobeyed. Goku's aura rose as if startled a silver skin that was less armor than permission. He did not sense malice, only tension, like a storm learning its alphabet. "What's happening?" he asked, though he already knew the answer in the way a muscle knows why it flexes. "My presence disturbs balance," came the reply. "This world has no language for faith. It interprets my will as conflict. So it wants a fight. Perhaps it only knows how to listen through struggle." The golden air thickened. From the ripples, two shapes emerged, not beings, but stances embodied conviction. One radiated the discipline of order, edges precise as oathcraft. The other thrummed with reckless freedom, a blur of choices uncoerced. Between them, reality strained like cloth pulled from both ends. Motion without objects, pressure without force, a duel of definitions. The Emperor lifted a hand not to command, but to understand, and extended a lattice of light through the conflict. It was a reflex older than empires. Build a frame, tame the weather. The storm recoiled, then returned with interest. The lattice became resistance. Resistance became fuel. Order had turned inadvertently into an aggressor. Goku stepped through the first wave. The strike had no mass, yet struck where spirit lives. He moved as through deep water, every gesture deliberate, every muscle taught to ignore the lie that heaviness is defeat. He let the silver sheath hum at a frequency just below panic, then lowered it another shade until panic had nothing to grip. Whiz peering from a slope of space-time read the fight as calculus. Two functions intersecting each, attempting to solve the other by substitution. Beerus wanted simpler arithmetic. He preferred fist to theorem, yet even he could feel it, the ground rules of a universe, arguing about themselves. Inside the golden storm, Goku's instincts sharpened into absence. Ultra instinct was not power. It was subtraction. He dismissed the need to control outcomes and stood so completely inside the present moment that there was no room for assault. The storm aimed. He was already elsewhere, not by speed, but by refusal to share coordinates with violence. Strikes arrived and found only the reflection of their own intent. The Emperor watched with a hunger he had never named. What moved before him was freedom, without tantrum, spontaneity, disciplined by attention. The emotion stirred the warp through him. Admiration is also a tide. Shadows thickened in response, multiplying like thoughts that breed when stared at. Faith turned to caution, caution to control, control to resistance. He recognized the pattern as one recognizes a scar without touching it. "You're making it worse." Goku called across the quiet. "I know. Then let go." "I cannot. The bridge would collapse and your world would suffer." "Then hold on differently." He obeyed. It was a simple obedience and therefore difficult. He retracted the lattice, withdrew the angles, permitted ambiguity to be weather rather than enemy. Where his will had been a wall, he allowed it to become a shore. The storm encountered coastline and discovered rhythm. The pressure did not vanish. It learned where to break. Mortals felt the argument resolve without knowing it had occurred. Animals lifted their heads and found the wind changed. The tide added one unnecessary inch and then apologized by retreating early. City traffic stumbled for half a minute and then synchronized like schools of fish. A night nurse whose patience had been measured in thimblefuls discovered that bitterness fits less comfortably in a chest that has just exhaled. None of these mattered singly. Together they meant that reality had remembered how to behave politely. The two figures' orders, stance, and freedoms faded into each other until neither could be told from the other. Not compromise. Reconciliation. Goku opened his eyes into the gentled gold. He was breathing as if he had slept. The Emperor's projection had lost severity. It suggested humanness. "You were scared," Goku said, not accusing, only accurate. "Even gods know fear," came the admission. "We simply hide it behind necessity." "Maybe that's the snare," Goku answered. "Thinking you have to be something. Sometimes you just are." The sentence did not strike. It landed. The Emperor allowed its weight to rest, where command usually sat, and found he did not buckle. His projection stabilized not by gripping harder, but by allowing the surface beneath to reveal it had always been solid. Below, the Earth's atmosphere shimmered once more, then cleared. The second sun shed its fever and settled back into watchfulness. Whis allowed himself a breath he had not noticed he was holding. Beerus muttered that if they broke the planet, he would break something in return, and Whis humored him, because humor is one of the better forms of prayer. Peace reported itself in particulars. A child who had been angry all week forgot why. A soldier awake on guard duty found that the world sounded like it did when he was 10 and safe. A broken machine started when struck gently instead of hard. These are the metrics of true victories, small, unadvertised, durable. Inside the sphere, Goku lowered his hands and sat cross-legged in midair without thinking it odd. "So, are we done?" "For now," said the Emperor. "The warp has learned your name. Sounds creepy. It means it cannot forget you, and I cannot forget what I have seen." "What did you see?" "Possibility." He turned his attention downward. "Your kind lives inside impermanence and calls it joy," he considered aloud. "Mine constructed eternity and called it safety. Both may be prisons." Goku shrugged, and the gesture contained a lifetime's worth of sanity. "If it's a prison, the door's usually unlocked," he said. "You can leave it and come back with food." Something like a smile occurred in the projection, not as expression, but as loosening. He envied the man's authority over lightness. To laugh at the edge of infinity is a right he had not kept for himself. The light condensed as he chose to withdraw. "Our exchange has quieted the warp," he told the world he had come to respect. "I will leave before curiosity becomes hunger again." "You'll be back," Goku said, not as a question. "The bridge remains," came the answer. He dimmed until absence and presence were indistinguishable. The second sun continued to hang above Earth, but it no longer pressed on the mind. It had become a fact, and being a fact, no longer argued with anyone. In his own universe, the Emperor sank once more into storm. The familiar agonies presented themselves for duty, but beneath them was something new, a rhythm that did not plead. Ultra instinct translated into the language of soul whispered through him, as a principle to lead is not to restrain. He set the sentence upon the shelf where he stored the laws that had cost him most to learn. Attendants near the throne marked the hour by incense and calculation, and did not notice that the Astronomicon shone a shade cleaner. Somewhere a choir of psychers reached a chord they had never reached together before, and did not shatter upon it. On Mars, a logic engine halted a loop it had been running for 90 years, and took a quiet breath no engineer had thought to program. The Emperor extended his perception outward to check where the chaos echoes had pressed. They had already withdrawn. The flavor of this universe did not please them. It lacked the iron to rust. He felt responsible for keeping it so, and recognized the danger of that feeling. Responsibility hardens quickly into ownership. Ownership into command. He forced himself to translate responsibility into stewardship and let the words soften his jaw. On Earth, dawn poured like light shaken from a pitcher. Goku landed by a river and tested silence the way a cook tastes broth. The current did not ask him to improve it. He thought about how a fight could end by teaching the participants a better grammar. He thought about how many of his victories had been loud and how many of his lessons had been quiet. He found himself grateful without object. Whiz watched from a distance and considered the mathematics of courtesy. It pleased him to admit that the empire of equations sometimes kneels before one honest breath. Beerus considered hunger his favorite truth and discovered he was less hungry than usual. He resented the discovery and then decided not to. The second sun glimmered once, faint as gratitude. Mortals forgot it for the length of a conversation and remembered it again when they needed to walk home more safely than usual. That is how miracles should function, not as spectacles, but as infrastructure. In the quiet at the center of everything, the Emperor sat upon his throne and looked at the road between attention and control. For the first time in longer than numbers know how to count, he refused to step from one to the other. He let attention be attention, a light that does not seize what it reveals. If he had been capable of sleeping, he might have slept. Lacking that mercy, he found the next best thing. He rested inside a decision. He sent no message to the Golden World. He did not need to. The bridge remained because he no longer tried to hold it. It remained for the same reason rivers remain: gravity plus patience. If the other universe required him, it would not petition. It would breathe, and he would feel it. Night carried Earth forward. Street lamps hummed beneath the patient dawn, hanging in the wrong corner of the sky. Children dreamed of climbing staircases that rose into light and woke holding the first rung. An old rival brewed tea for a visitor he once would have struck. A scientist whose instruments still refused to quantify the anomaly wrote a sentence in her notebook that made her colleagues think she had turned to poetry. The constant above us suggests we have been mispronouncing the universe. Goku returned home before the birds had finished arguing about worm rights. He stood in the doorway, listened to a house breathe, and stepped inside with the care one gives to holy places that do not know they are holy. Breakfast and day work awaited, and he found himself glad for both. He told no one what had transpired. Silence was not secrecy, it was accuracy. Across realities, older hungers rolled over, bored by the absence of fear. The Emperor's mind, accustomed to atrocities, measured in centuries, allowed one human thought to cross the night and sit beside him like a companion who understands without comment. Perhaps freedom is another form of order, the kind you discover rather than impose. The second sun held its station. The world learned how to live while watched without being ruled. And in the deep architecture of two universes, a new law began to write itself. Clause by unhurried clause in a script too elegant for kings and too simple for tyrants. Power that refuses possession becomes light. VH'd. The second sun had taught the sky a new restraint. It did not rise or set, it abided. Seasons shifted their weight around it and discovered they could carry winter without bitterness and summer without pride. People made schedules that pretended not to consider the extra light, and then at the last line of every list made room for a pause they could not name. Patience, like any weather, becomes normal once it stops apologizing. Gods adapt more slowly. The palace that did not exist within space considered what it meant to be surprised. Attendants moved with ceremonial precision through halls designed to be walked by inevitability. Servants who had never learned how to whisper practiced the skill in case the new requirement for the universe included humility. At the center of that vast quiet, the child who ruled everything blinked, and his blink rippled out as law. Zeno turned his face toward the foreign glow. He did not love it or hate it. He categorized, and the categories came up short. He understood phenomena by what they did when he touched them. So at last, he decided to touch. The act required no gesture. In some places, a lifted hand turned oceans into ink and mountains into discarded punctuation. In this place, the intention alone was enough. Erasure arrived as a conclusion, stepping backward through its own argument. The golden sphere over the blue world did not shudder. It simply became unnecessary to the grammar of existence. Across earth and through heaven, no one heard a sound. The second sun brightened by a fraction that could not be measured and then lost its edges. The radiant human shape at its hard armor suggested crown implied thinned to translucence. Then to the idea of translucence, then to a memory the sky might someday misremember. Light remained as residue, like a concept that refuses to leave a sentence, even after the word has been crossed out. On the other side of realities, the Emperor felt the blade without sharpness pass through his projection. He had known it might come. He had prepared no defense. Erasure was not force. It was editorial authority. He allowed the edit to proceed as far as it could. Matter vanished, then metaphor, then presence reduced to premise. At the point where the universe expected nothing to be left, something remained attention. Where the projection had stood, a listening persisted. Zeno noticed. He always noticed what endured. He pressed again, not impatient merely, thorough. Erasure walked another step down the ladder of being, removing not just expression, but the capacity for expression. The palace waited for the world to agree that nothing was there. But the court felt under the polished floor of certainty a thrum like distant footsteps. What remained was not a thing. It was a direction all minds could take if they wished toward meaning. You cannot erase a road by deleting travelers. The Grand Priest narrowed his eyes by a width only ceremony could measure. Mathematics crowded his vision and then dismissed itself. There is no object, he said almost to himself. There is only consent. He looked beyond the palace and the shining corridors, beyond the ledgers of creation and the clean books of destruction, and saw what Zeno had stumbled upon. Not a creature to be erased, but a multitude that could not be tallied. Billions upon billions of human souls in another universe, uncounted and uncountable, called to something they could not live without and could not prove. Their attention, braided through millennia, reached through the skin of realities the way roots find water under rock. The Grand Priest had seen power. He had seen devotion. He had never seen devotion function as infrastructure. The court felt none of this as a sight or a sound. They experienced it as a failure of emptiness to remain empty. Zeno tilted his head. The child who had ended universes as a form of tidying did not experience confusion often. He felt no fear. He did not need fear to recognize the limits of his own sentence. Erasure had done what it always did, remove the need of a phenomenon to continue. And yet, the world insisted. Whatever watched from inside the insistence was not surviving. It was choosing to keep being relevant. The Emperor did not speak. Words would have turned this into a debate, and debates can be won or lost. He permitted Zeno to discover that some relationships are not arguments. He permitted the child to feel the shape of a refusal that contained no defiance. Below the palace and above the world, the golden residue changed its posture. It became not a person, but a vantage. Cities beneath it felt their corners straighten, as if an unseen plumb line had been dropped from the sky. A beggar felt sudden irritation at a habit of self-contempt and stood to test whether the habit was inevitable. A tired mother realized the day did not hate her. It merely had teeth. Sailors discovered that the second sun, though it cast no shadow, could serve as a point of sail more reliable than any compass. None of these things defied physics. They embarrassed cynicism. The Grand Priest stepped half a thought toward his king. "Majesty," he said, and the word had a weight he had not intended. "The phenomenon yields to your will in all domains where will is sufficient. It disregards your will in the domain where will is irrelevant." Zeno considered the counsel without annoyance. He did not hold pride the way older gods wear it like armor. He wore it as a hat he could set down without ceremony. He peered through the hole his power had made and saw through no sight of his own what the emperor allowed him to see. A dead world where men had hammered worship into iron until the iron learned to pray. A throne that kept a corpse awake because the living could not bear to live without the dead. Fleets navigating a sea of madness by sight of a star that never set because a man would not let it set. In that universe, erasure would have been mercy. But what endured here in this other place was not empire. It was attention braided into purpose so long and so hard it had become quiet. Zeno let his hand fall, though he had never raised it. In the golden residue, a new contour formed, almost a face, but softened into courtesy. The palace felt a change not in atmosphere, but in posture. The watcher acknowledged being watched. That admission passed through realities like a nod across a crowded room. Words came very few because truths that can stand require little furniture. You end what is the present said neither flattering nor accusing. I tend what means. The sentence did not trip any alarms. It did not register in the ledgers. It sat beside Zeno like a toy, placed gently upon a floor waiting to be claimed or ignored. The child sovereign studied it with a seriousness that would have frightened any adult if adults had been allowed in that room. He did not answer out loud. His reply occurred as action withheld. Across the multiple skies, Beerus felt something unclench that he had not noticed clenching. He had been prepared for violence to become rules again. He did not enjoy rules he had not written. Discovering that the rule would be restraint offended him less than he expected. He found himself, without quite meaning to, not angry. Was watched his lord remember how to breathe between moments and permitted himself a very small satisfaction. The lesson was meant for us, after all he said to no one who needed telling. On earth, people said the light had flickered. They were wrong. The world had blinked. The body does that when dust lands where tears begin. Goku ascended once more, not out of urgency, but out of a sense that conversations worth keeping alive deserve attendance. The second son met him with the demeanor of a host who has learned the guest's favorite silence. He hovered there, arms folded loosely, understanding without analysis that something enormous had not happened. He waited. Waiting done correctly is a form of participation. The residue brightened enough to cast a thought. It was not a greeting. It was recognition that the man who learned to move without friction had earned a place near negotiations where friction had never been permitted. The presence turned a fraction toward him the way a mountain turns, imperceptibly, and with the authority of things that have never hurried. "You okay?" Goku asked, offering the clumsy rope of language to an entity that did not need ropes. Better the presence conveyed. If sound had carried the word, it would have been dry and grateful. He has learned where I do not exist. Goku grinned. And where you do, that is less important, the presence admitted, and if a smile could exist without lips, it existed then. The Grand Priest listened across distances to a conversation in which neither party sought to own the last word. He studied the relief running through the palace, and realized it was not fear abating, but effort relaxing. An empire had met a parish and discovered that neither needed the other to kneel. He bowed his head by the smallest acceptable degree. "Majesty," he said, "the phenomenon is no longer a threat to order." Zeno did not reply. He watched the blue world spin beneath the persistent gold, and for the first time since he had been taught that endings are clean, suspected that some continuations are cleaner. The court began to breathe as if oxygen had recently been invented. Erasure dispersed itself like mist. It had not failed. It had performed perfectly within its jurisdiction and then stopped at the border. Discovering borders is how laws become wise. The emperor let the listening he had maintained bloom back into form slowly, as one returns a book to the shelf with a hand that knows the wood. He did not reassemble the figure of a man. He retained the vantage because vantage had done what shape could not survive without resisting. He would remember this. In his own universe, the throne's attendants recorded nothing unusual, which is itself a kind of miracle. The Astronomicon burned with a steadiness that could be mistaken for normal. A technician whose job was to worry found himself untaxed for a minute and did not rush to fill the quiet. On a ship 3 sectors away, a navigator blinked salt from a third eye and realized the storm he had been bracing for had chosen another route. In the halls of the palace outside space, a law unspoken learned to sit beside a law absolute. Zeno turned from the window that was not a window and walked away with the careful steps of a child not wishing to wake a sleeping dog. He would return to games that were not games and records that were not records. Today he had found where his sentence ended. That knowledge did not lessen him. It made him precise. On Earth, the wind sampled the edges of new weather and decided to keep it. Markets opened. Schools called roll. Somewhere a scientist proposed a conference whose subject line read with uncommon courage, on the uses of mystery. She expected mockery. She received too many registrations to count. Goku returned to ground as one returns from a long run in which the point was not winning, but remembering that lungs are trustworthy. He did not try to tell anyone what had happened because there was no decent verb for it. He simply trained that day with a gentleness his punches did not know they possessed, and the mountains answered by remaining where they were without feeling challenged. Night arrived and the second sun refused to leave. It declined to argue with the stars declined to argue back. Compromise is sometimes just the polite name for coexistence. The emperor back upon the throne occupied the same square inch of dying body he had always occupied and found that inch wider. He had faced erasure and discovered it could not remove what he had learned to be not a god, not a man, not a machine that drinks souls to keep ships on course, but a steward of meanings his people could not bear to carry without him. He did not rejoice. He does not rejoice. He permitted himself a human luxury rarer in him than victory, the admission that he had been instructed. He replayed the sensation of being deleted and kept. He catalogued not the terror of loss, but the relief of relinquishment. Erasure had stripped him down to attention. Attention had proved enough. He decided quietly, and at a level no priest would ever hear, to trust attention more often than command. Somewhere in the reptile logic of chaos, a frown traveled like a cold front. This other universe did not respond correctly to pressure. It metabolized fear into patience instead of frenzy. There are worlds not worth the cost of corruption, and this might be one. The dark rolled over and waited for a different night. Zeno slept. The palace allowed itself the experiment of dreaming. In the dream there were toys he had never seen and could not break, not because they resisted him, but because they made breaking irrelevant. He woke amused and did not erase anything as a way of respecting the dream. Whis sipped the kind of tea that only gods can prepare properly, and thought about the sentence he would add to his private scripture power that refuses possession becomes light. He wondered who had taught him that, and smiled when he realized the teacher had not used a word. Beerus examined the empty space in his hunger and did not rush to fill it. He stretched like a cat that remembers it is not hunted. The stretch took the shape of mercy and then forgot its own name. The second sun drew no conclusions. It remained. Beneath it, the world learned that some threats end by telling you what they are not, and some rescues arrive as the refusal to intervene. And high above, between stars and silences, two kinds of sovereignty took each other's measure and stepped back without retreating. What had begun as curiosity had been tested by erasure and found to be meaning. Meaning, it turns out, is harder to kill than matter. The sky carried on. The gold did not fade. The chapter of the universe that had almost been a deletion ended as a margin note. Here authority discovers respect. The second sun had taught the sky a new restraint. It did not rise or set. It abided. Seasons shifted their weight around it, and discovered they could carry winter without bitterness and summer without pride. People made schedules that pretended not to consider the extra light, and then at the last line of every list made room for a pause they could not name. Patience, like any weather, becomes normal once it stops apologizing. Gods adapt more slowly. The palace that did not exist within space considered what it meant to be surprised. Attendants moved with ceremonial precision through halls designed to be walked by inevitability. Servants who had never learned how to whisper practiced the skill in case the new requirement for the universe included humility. At the center of that vast quiet, the child who ruled everything blinked, and his blink rippled out as law. Zeno turned his face toward the foreign glow. He did not love it or hate it. He categorized, and the categories came up short. He understood phenomena by what they did when he touched them. So at last, he decided to touch. The act required no gesture. In some places, a lifted hand turned oceans into ink and mountains into discarded punctuation. In this place, the intention alone was enough. Erasure arrived as a conclusion, stepping backward through its own argument. The golden sphere over the blue world did not shudder. It simply became unnecessary to the grammar of existence. Across earth and through heaven, no one heard a sound. The second sun brightened by a fraction that could not be measured and then lost its edges. The radiant human shape at its heart armor suggested crown implied thinned to translucence, then to the idea of translucence, then to a memory the sky might someday misremember. Light remained as residue, like a concept that refuses to leave a sentence even after the word has been crossed out. On the other side of realities, the Emperor felt the blade without sharpness pass through his projection. He had known it might come. He had prepared no defense. Erasure was not force. It was editorial authority. He allowed the edit to proceed as far as it could. Matter vanished, then metaphor, then presence reduced to premise. At the point where the universe expected nothing to be left, something remained attention. Where the projection had stood, a listening persisted. Zeno noticed. He always noticed what endured. He pressed again, not impatient, merely thorough. Erasure walked another step down the ladder of being, removing not just expression, but the capacity for expression. The palace waited for the world to agree that nothing was there. But the court felt under the polished floor of certainty a thrum like distant footsteps. What remained was not a thing. It was a direction all minds could take if they wished toward meaning. You cannot erase a road by deleting travelers. The Grand Priest narrowed his eyes by a width only ceremony could measure. Mathematics crowded his vision and then dismissed itself. "There is no object," he said, almost to himself. "There is only consent." He looked beyond the palace and the shining corridors, beyond the ledgers of creation and the clean books of destruction, and saw what Zeno had stumbled upon. Not a creature to be erased, but a multitude that could not be tallied. Billions upon billions of human souls in another universe, uncounted and uncountable, called to something they could not live without and could not prove. Their attention braided through millennia, reached through the skin of realities the way roots find water under rock. The Grand Priest had seen power. He had seen devotion. He had never seen devotion function as infrastructure. The court felt none of this as a sight or a sound. They experienced it as a failure of emptiness, to remain empty. Zeno tilted his head. The child who had ended universes as a form of tidying did not experience confusion often. He felt no fear. He did not need fear to recognize the limits of his own sentence. Erasure had done what it always did, remove the need of a phenomenon to continue. And yet the world insisted. Whatever watched from inside the insistence was not surviving. It was choosing to keep being relevant. The emperor did not speak. Words would have turned this into a debate, and debates can be won or lost. He permitted Zeno to discover that some relationships are not arguments. He permitted the child to feel the shape of a refusal that contained no defiance. Below the palace and above the world, the golden residue changed its posture. It became not a person, but a vantage. Cities beneath it felt their corners straighten, as if an unseen plumb line had been dropped from the sky. A beggar felt sudden irritation at a habit of self-contempt and stood to test whether the habit was inevitable. A tired mother realized the day did not hate her. It merely had teeth. Sailors discovered that the second sun, though it cast no shadow, could serve as a point of sail more reliable than any compass. None of these things defied physics. They embarrassed cynicism. The Grand Priest stepped half a thought toward his king. "Majesty," he said, and the word had a weight he had not intended. "The phenomenon yields to your will in all domains where will is sufficient. It disregards your will in the domain where will is irrelevant." Zeno considered the counsel without annoyance. He did not hold pride the way older gods wear it like armor. He wore it as a hat he could set down without ceremony. He peered through the hole his power had made and saw through no sight of his own what the emperor allowed him to see. A dead world where men had hammered worship into iron until the iron learned to pray. A throne that kept a corpse awake because the living could not bear to live without the dead. Fleets navigating a sea of madness by sight of a star that never set because a man would not let it set. In that universe, erasure would have been mercy. But what endured here in this other place was not empire. It was a tension braided into purpose so long and so hard, it had become quiet. Zeno let his hand fall, though he had never raised it. In the golden residue, a new contour formed, almost a face, but softened into courtesy. The palace felt a change not in atmosphere, but in posture. The watcher acknowledged being watched. That admission passed through realities like a nod across a crowded room. Words came very few because truths that can stand require little furniture. You end what is the present said, neither flattering nor accusing. I tend what means. The sentence did not trip any alarms. It did not register in the ledgers. It sat beside Zeno like a toy placed gently upon a floor waiting to be claimed or ignored. The child sovereign studied it with a seriousness that would have frightened any adult if adults had been allowed in that room. He did not answer out loud. His reply occurred as action withheld. Across the multiple skies, Beerus felt something unclench that he had not noticed clenching. He had been prepared for violence to become rules again. He did not enjoy rules he had not written. Discovering that the rule would be restraint offended him less than he expected. He found himself, without quite meaning to, not angry. Wis watched his lord remember how to breathe between moments and permitted himself a very small satisfaction. The lesson was meant for us, after all, he said to no one who needed telling. On Earth, people said the light had flickered. They were wrong. The world had blinked. The body does that when dust lands where tears begin. Goku ascended once more, not out of urgency, but out of a sense that conversations worth keeping alive deserve attendance. The second son met him with the demeanor of a host who has learned the guest's favorite silence. He hovered there, arms folded loosely, understanding without analysis that something enormous had not happened. He waited. Waiting done correctly is a form of participation. The residue brightened enough to cast a thought. It was not a greeting. It was recognition that the man who learned to move without friction had earned a place near negotiations where friction had never been permitted. The presence turned a fraction toward him the way a mountain turns, imperceptibly, and with the authority of things that have never hurried. "You okay?" Goku asked, offering the clumsy rope of language to an entity that did not need ropes. Better the presence conveyed. If sound had carried the word, it would have been dry and grateful. "He has learned where I do not exist." Goku grinned. "And where you do, that is less important," the presence admitted, and if a smile could exist without lips, it existed then. The Grand Priest listened across distances to a conversation in which neither party sought to own the last word. He studied the relief running through the palace and realized it was not fear abating, but effort relaxing. An empire had met a parish and discovered that neither needed the other to kneel. He bowed his head by the smallest acceptable degree. "Majesty," he said, "the phenomenon is no longer a threat to order." Zino did not reply. He watched the blue world spin beneath the persistent gold, and for the first time since he had been taught that endings are clean, suspected that some continuations are cleaner. The court began to breathe, as if oxygen had recently been invented. Erasure dispersed itself like mist. It had not failed. It had performed perfectly within its jurisdiction and then stopped at the border. Discovering borders is how laws become wise. The Emperor let the listening he had maintained bloom back into form slowly, as one returns a book to the shelf with a hand that knows the wood. He did not reassemble the figure of a man. He retained the vantage because vantage had done what shape could not survive without resisting. He would remember this. In his own universe, the throne's attendants recorded nothing unusual, which is itself a kind of miracle. The Astronomicon burned with a steadiness that could be mistaken for normal. A technician whose job was to worry found himself untaxed for a minute and did not rush to fill the quiet. On a ship 3 sectors away, a navigator blinked salt from a third eye and realized the storm he had been bracing for had chosen another route. In the halls of the palace, outside space, a law unspoken learned to sit beside a law absolute. Zino turned from the window that was not a window and walked away with the careful steps of a child not wishing to wake a sleeping dog. He would return to games that were not games and records that were not records. Today, he had found where his sentence ended. That knowledge did not lessen him. It made him precise. On Earth, the wind sampled the edges of new weather and decided to keep it. Markets opened. Schools called roll. Somewhere a scientist proposed a conference whose subject line read with uncommon courage on the uses of mystery. She expected mockery. She received too many registrations to count. Goku returned to ground as one returns from a long run in which the point was not winning, but remembering that lungs are trustworthy. He did not try to tell anyone what had happened because there was no decent verb for it. He simply trained that day with a gentleness his punches did not know they possessed, and the mountains answered by remaining where they were, without feeling challenged. Night arrived, and the second sun refused to leave. It declined to argue with the stars. The stars declined to argue back. Compromise is sometimes just the polite name for coexistence. The emperor back upon the throne occupied the same square inch of dying body he had always occupied, and found that inch wider. He had faced erasure and discovered it could not remove what he had learned to be not a god, not a man, not a machine that drinks souls to keep ships on course, but a steward of meanings his people could not bear to carry without him. He did not rejoice. He does not rejoice. He permitted himself a human luxury rarer in him than victory, the admission that he had been instructed. He replayed the sensation of being deleted and kept. He catalogued not the terror of loss, but the relief of relinquishment. Erasure had stripped him down to attention. Attention had proved enough. He decided quietly and at a level no priest would ever hear to trust attention more often than command. Somewhere in the reptile logic of chaos, a frown traveled like a cold front. This other universe did not respond correctly to pressure. It metabolized fear into patience instead of frenzy. There are worlds not worth the cost of corruption, and this might be one. The dark rolled over and waited for a different night. Zeno slept. The palace allowed itself the experiment of dreaming. In the dream there were toys he had never seen and could not break, not because they resisted him, but because they made breaking irrelevant. He woke amused and did not erase anything as a way of respecting the dream. Was sipped the kind of tea that only gods can prepare properly, and thought about the sentence he would add to his private scripture power, that refuses possession becomes light. He wondered who had taught him that, and smiled when he realized the teacher had not used a word. Beerus examined the empty space in his hunger and did not rush to fill it. He stretched like a cat that remembers it is not hunted. The stretch took the shape of mercy and then forgot its own name. The second sun drew no conclusions. It remained. Beneath it, the world learned that some threats end by telling you what they are not, and some rescues arrive as the refusal to intervene. And high above, between stars and silences, two kinds of sovereignty took each other's measure and stepped back without retreating. What had begun as curiosity had been tested by erasure and found to be meaning. Meaning, it turns out, is harder to kill than matter. The sky carried on. The gold did not fade. The chapter of the universe that had almost been a deletion ended as a margin note here authority discovers respect. Sleep arrived to the blue world like a new religion. It spread not as darkness, but as permission. Under the patient gold of the second sun night, learned to coexist with day, and in that delicate truce, something loosened in the minds of living things. The first dream did not belong to any one person. It belonged to the world. It began with small revisions. A fisherman closed his eyes and found the sea breathing to his rhythm. A child's nightmare arrived on schedule and then missed its cue. In mountain monasteries, monks felt their thoughts step aside for a silence that did not need guarding. The wind moved with deliberate kindness, and leaves returned the favor. Far above the golden residue in the sky did nothing at all, which was the most dangerous kindness of all. The warp did not cross into this universe. It learned to echo here. In the echo, Key discovered a mirror. Emotions condensed and took on weight. not enough to injure more than enough to be noticed. Warriors who had broken limits for sport now found their limits listening back. Joy thickened into warmth in the bones. Rage cooled into a metal that remembered it had once been ore. Grief uncoiled into patience. Then came the figures. No gates tore open, no hierarchies of hell unfolded. Shapes rose from the sleep of the strong as steam rises from hot stones. They did not replace their hosts. They stood beside them. A swordsman dreamed of precision, so pure it cut his shadow free. A healer dreamed of pain so deep it learned to speak with courtesy. In the high gravity of the Saiyan heart, the phenomenon gathered like weather. Vegeta sensed it first, because pride notices any change in pressure. He woke before dawn with his breath already warm for battle, and the taste of iron behind his teeth. The training yard looked ordinary. The air did not. The sound of his own heartbeat arrived from a step behind him, and when he turned, the yard widened to make room. The figure wore his history. It stood with the relaxed cruelty he had once mistaken for freedom, the mark on its brow burning like an old verdict. Not a copy, not an apparition, but a posture given form, the quick violence of Meijin Vegeta polished to a cold shine by the universe's new habit of dreaming. They did not speak. Speech would have made it argument. They required something cleaner. Vegeta moved first, as he always had. Power gathered condensed, and line by line drew the old shape of a man who had once declared himself complete. The figure mirrored him without haste. When they collided, the ground held. The air accepted the blow and folded it into its own logic. The exchange felt like writing one sentence two ways. Vegeta threw combinations that were once apologies, disguised as offense. The figure answered with the exact economy of an oath. Their auras struck like weather fronts. Sparks flew and dissolved into the morning, which refused to be impressed. He had learned much since the mark had burned away. He had learned to love without bargaining and to lose without becoming smaller. But muscle remembers, and pride keeps a ledger. The figure's strikes landed not on his body, but on those old entries, each blow a line item being audited. He blocked a high kick and felt the ledger tear. He took a punch to the ribs and realized the pain carried his own handwriting. He did not attempt to win. He revised. Where the figure insisted on purity of violence, he offered precision without hatred. Where it demanded control, he brought patience. He allowed opening after opening to go unused, and the unused openings began to alter the fight more than any strike could have. The figure's power hummed at a frequency built for escalation. Denied escalation, it sought translation. When Vegeta finally spoke, it was not to the thing in front of him. It was to himself. "I do not need you," he said. And the yard took the sentence like a nail takes a hammer and holds. The figure paused, then tested the sentence and found no weakness. It flickered. Not defeated, released. The mark on its brow dimmed to a memory of light. The posture softened into possibility and stepped back into the man who had carried it across years like a trophy with no house to live in. Vegeta exhaled and felt the yard shrink to its proper size again. He did not bow. He did not gloat. He went to make tea with hands that remembered how to carry heat without shaking. Across the world, other reckonings unfolded with less noise. A martial artist dreamed of winning and woke with the urge to apologize before practicing. A tyrant began to sentence a city and stopped mid-breath because the word tasted like metal filings. A child who had decided to become terrible because fear is a kind of armor found sugar too sweet and changed his mind. Goku met his own weather at noon above a quiet field where insects worked out their ancient math. He did not summon it. He allowed it to arrive. It came as a shimmer at the edges of vision, the way danger announces itself to animals. The heat around him acquired contour. The sunlight thickened not into haze, but into attention. The shape that stepped out of that attention wore his frame without kindness. Its eyes were his when battle became a drug. Its stance made no promises beyond impact. The world around them stepped a fraction farther away and then, curious, leaned back in. Goku lifted his hands and found them lighter than memory. The figure took the mirror guard he had used the first time he learned to move without moving. It did not grin. He did not either. They began. The fight contained the elegance of truth told quickly. No wasted motion, no argument with gravity. Ultra instinct made the body a well-briefed witness. The figure answered with the same technique minus the tenderness that had crept into Goku's later years. Every near miss wrote a line of commentary in the air, what you could be if you decided mercy was a delay rather than a value. He recognized the temptation. He refused to be outraged by it. He refused also to be recruited. The universe is patient with forms that do not insist on themselves. When the figure pressed for dominance, the wind moved to where the figure was not. When it attempted to isolate him from the world, the light conspired with the dust to make him part of it. His feet found the ground without looking, made an ally of it, and returned with interest. The decisive moment arrived without fanfare. A punch came forward accurate enough to be a compliment. He could have slipped it. He could have shattered the wrist. He did neither. He stepped into it and accepted the fraction of pain it offered. The choice bewildered the figure, for its grammar had no word for consent. In the small confusion that followed, Goku placed his palm on its sternum and allowed everything he refused to hate to pass through his hand. The figure held together because stubbornness is a kind of craft. Then it remembered it was a dream and behaved like one. The edges softened. The texture learned humility. The stance crumpled into a new shape, readiness without hunger. He spoke not to teach, but to make the truth audible inside his own chest. You are how I live when I forget why. The figure nodded with his neck. It belonged to him again. It returned not as a master returning to a house, but as a guest given a decent room and a key that works only when asked. When the world dreams properly, gods notice. Whis watched measurement fail with impeccable manners. His staff found no numbers that mattered and therefore concluded correctly. Beerus tasted the air for the copper of crisis and found instead the aftertaste of a storm that had chosen to rain elsewhere. He stretched and did not say he was relieved. The Grand Priest studied the phenomena from the palace that had learned recently how to respect its own borders. Sleep, he realized, was performing here what worship performed in other realms, distributing meaning. The dream did not exalt. It equalized. It took the private labor of the soul and made infrastructure out of it. Dangerous, he thought, and then reconsidered what danger meant in a world that metabolized fear into sobriety. The warp's echo strengthened and then leveled. It behaved like music, written for a choir that had never learned to read, and yet could still sing on pitch. Attention braided itself into a net so fine it did not catch anything. It only kept things from forgetting they were afloat. Across cities, unnoticed mercies occurred. A surgeon's hand, as tired as law, steadied where it would have trembled. A thief decided to leave the window closed. A legislator rewrote a clause so the cruel would find it tedious. Lovers argued and remembered what the argument was for. A lonely man's houseplants, which had stubbornly refused to thrive under lectures, discovered they preferred a humming he did not know he knew. Vegeta returned to the yard at dusk and found it smaller in the good way. He traced the outline of his shadow and saw it refuse the old angle. A shape stood beside him that looked like remorse, and then felt more like respect. He did not reject it. He refused also to install it as a god. He went on with his training, and the air permitted him to feel fast without needing to prove it. Goku sat with his back against a tree that had seen more births than wars. The field recovered from their exchange the way wounds do when you stop arguing with them. He breathed and noticed that the breath left him better than it found him. He did not think of exploiting what had happened. He thought of cooking dinner for people who had spent the day doing less dramatic work than reconciling with their ghosts. High above the golden vantage did nothing still which was now an act. The Emperor maintained attention with the care a craftsman gives a fine edge. He did not push. He did not soothe. He watched a universe teach itself how to disagree with itself without breaking. He had fought wars that killed the same lesson every century, and then hired priests to certify the corpses as victories. Here, no one certified anything. They simply learned. For a brief width of eternity, he wondered what his own people might have become had they been allowed to dream like this without being punished for it by the dark. The thought arrived carrying grief in a small cup and did not spill. He set it down. He is careful with grief. He knows it stains. Chaos, peering at the edge of all this modest reform, curled its lip and turned away. There are appetites that prefer fat over fiber. The harvest here would be lean. Let them dream, the dark decided. Dreams teach patience. Patience ruins panics. Panic pays better. Night deepened and discovered it could be kind without being weak. The second sun dimmed a degree that could not be graphed, a courtesy to constellations who had seniority. Stars flattered, brightened by an amount only poets can measure. In the palace beyond space, Zeno slept again, and the dream returned with improved furniture. In it he erased a toy, and the toy refused to mind because it had already been made into a story. He woke laughing, a small bell rung in a clean room and made no changes to the day. Was added a line to his quiet catechism and pretended not to. Beerus wandered his domains and found fewer excuses for anger than he had planned. He tried to improvise some and failed, which offended him briefly before boredom relieved him of the grudge. Morning arrived and found the world still doing its million honest things. The dream did not end at waking. It distributed itself, a slow river of corrections running through the day. A hand that had always slapped learned to hesitate, and then to miss, and then to rest. A sentence that had always ended in cruelty rehearsed another ending and liked the sound. The new habit was not spectacular. Spectacle is for announcements. This was policy. Goku and Vegeta crossed paths that afternoon. Nothing in the air required them to speak of what had happened. Their glances carried inventory and approval, still here, still ourselves a little more so. They trained without dramatics. The dust rose settled and did not record the session as an event. The Emperor, who has no hours, marked the day anyway. He did not congratulate himself. He allowed himself the more severe grace of not intervening further. On Terra, a wire hummed at a pitch only machines admire, and the throne took that as a compliment. In the human ocean of his own realm, a handful of prayers arrived, lighter than usual, and needed fewer interpreters to be understood. When the world sleeps properly, its mornings write legislation. By sunset, the new law had become custom power that remembers what it is for, does not need to terrify. The law filed itself without clerks. The second sun kept its station. The universe closed its eyes when it needed to open them, when it should, and did not apologize for either. In the fields where insects performed their calculus, the numbers worked out, In the palaces where authority tries on outfits, the mirrors were kinder than usual. In the quiet wherein meaning is minted, two truths sat without jealousy, instinct disciplined by attention. Attention unafraid of instinct. The dream ended by becoming a way to stay awake. The world had learned to dream without breaking. The second sun held its station, and under its patient glow, a gentler grammar took root. Days moved like well-made hinges. Nights closed as softly as a book. In that new ease, a summons rose that was not a command. It crossed distances without leaving a line as wind crosses tall grass and the grass simply knows. Goku heard it while the field was still wet with morning. The air around him thinned until it felt like another kind of attention. He stood, brushed the earth from his palms, and stepped into the sky. The climb was effortless, not because he forced the body to obey, but because the body agreed. Space received him, as it always did politely, with a silence that made no promises. The golden vantage above earth brightened and opened like a lens. He entered. The light contained neither heat nor glare. It was not a place so much as a permission. Within it, distances rearranged themselves until nearness was the only measurement that mattered. The Emperor was present as a contour of radiance, with the courtesy of a man who has learned not to impose his face on strangers. He did not enlarge himself to impress, nor diminish to reassure. He brought no banners. He took the pose of attention and let the rest be inference. Goku halted, feeling the texture of the moment. A current ran through the light, not dangerous, only decisive. It asked nothing yet. Everything in him wished to answer. "You called," he said. I invited, the presence conveyed, and then with a gentleness that moved like a hand at the level of meaning. "Join me." The chamber of gold changed its posture. What had been boundless contracted not into walls, but into focus. Light gathered into filaments that braided themselves into a structure without corners, a crucible that did not enclose, but concentrated. Within that focus, specks of radiance condensed into a map, constellations arranged like thoughts, galaxies, aligned as if prayer beads strung across an invisible palm. The pattern did not depict the universe. It displayed the ways power could choose to mean something. The Emperor extended a fragment of himself toward Goku. It was not a hand. It was an intention shaped like mercy. The movement paused close to the center of Goku's chest, as if asking before touching. "Let me give you nothing you do not accept," the presence said. Goku met the light without flinching. Okay. Contact occurred with the care of a vow spoken at the correct volume. It was not a transfer of energy. It was recognition installed where pride might have sat. The body did not surge, it clarified. Ki lifted its head like a creature hearing its name, in a language it did not know it knew. The breath found a cadence older than the lungs and settled there. What grew was not more but truer. The golden chamber deepened. Threads of brilliance rewrote their relationship to one another. The map rebalanced. Where instinct had drawn a quick line and will had drawn a hard line, a third line entered flexible, tensile, exact. It bent light without breaking it. It asked gravity to be a partner. It behaved as if discipline and freedom had always been meant to share a sentence. The Emperor watched the adjustment with an attention that might once have been envy, and was now something more generous. He did not press. He only held the room steady, the way a craftsman holds a tool in the light until the tool teaches the hand what to do. Goku breathed, and breath became structure. Aura rose pale as morning, then bright as patient steel. The edge of him softened where it had been sharp from habit, and sharpened where kindness had made him vague. He felt the truth of it with the relief of a shoulder finally set into its socket after years of working around the pain. This is not a gift, the presence said, honest and therefore kind. It is consent, given shape. Goku smiled, small and real. I can work with that. The chamber opened further still. Above them, constellations rethreaded themselves into paths, and along those paths moved images of choices. Here was strength used to frighten, which turns power into hunger. Here was strength used to spare, which turns power into patience. Here was strength used without remembering what it is, for which turns power into noise. The forms did not judge. They demonstrated. The Emperor let a thought arise, the way a well offers water. I have kept my people alive by refusing to let go. I have called that stewardship. Sometimes it is. Often it is fear with epaulets. Goku did not answer with argument. He listened until the listening itself produced speech. Where I'm from, I got strong because there was always someone stronger. There wasn't time for rules. But when there was time, I learned them anyway. Not because someone made me, because they made sense. And when they did not, I left them behind. Light flexed around the words, testing them for vanity and finding none. The map brightened along several paths at once. In one will and instinct braided as equals. In another will smothered instinct and called the corpse order. In a third instinct rejected will and mistook the tantrum for freedom. The braided path did not promise victory. It promised continuity. A pulse went through the chamber, faint as a remembered bell. Beyond it, far beyond the warp, turned its face. As a predator turns from meat it does not prefer. The lesson learned in earlier storms held there is little to harvest where fear metabolizes into attention. The dark marked the place for later and withdrew. The crucible narrowed again, not to constrain, but to refine. The pressure on Goku's spirit increased until choice stopped being posture and became blood. He did not brace. He allowed. The aura shifted from silver to a white gold that carried warmth without waste. It did not flare. It illuminated. The change was not spectacle. It was competence acknowledged by reality. Movement simplified further, as if every muscle had finally read the same instructions and agreed on punctuation. The idea floor cooperated. The air and argument with nothing ended the argument. The Emperor observed, and the act of observing became instruction he had denied himself for longer than history's care to count. For most of his existence he had taught by pressure and preserved by denial. He had not trusted attention to suffice. Watching now, he understood that attention is not passive. It is gravity with manners. Show me the presence asked not to test, but to witness. Goku raised a hand. He did not summon. He did not gather. He arranged. From the center of his chest outward, Ki moved like a well-rehearsed choir at the instant the conductor lowers his arms, and the song must become itself. A line of white gold traveled down his arm and into his palm. It reached the air and, having found nothing to resist, did not explode. It went on thin and exact until it reached one of the bright paths the chamber had offered and traced it. Where the line passed, the path steadied. Where the path steadied, stars changed their minds about how to be stars. Just enough, never more. The Emperor felt the threat of it touch him. It did not burn. It insisted. Within the projection, ancient reflexes bristled the reflex to command, to codify, to shape the world into a verdict. He let them bristle. He let them pass. The insistence remained. It requested not obedience, not surrender, cooperation. He answered in the only dignified way, by consenting to be changed. His light did not increase. It clarified as glass clarifies, by relinquishing impurities. The outline that suggested a crown lost weight until it looked like responsibility instead of ownership. The armor implied by radiance stopped looking like walls and started looking like weatherproofing. He kept everything he needed and nothing he did not. Beyond the chamber, the golden vantage above the blue world brightened barely so little that only those who had taught themselves to measure kindness would have noticed. It was not a signal. It was the natural shine of something that had ceased to be at war with itself. Down on earth, people sensed a change they could not name. A mother kissed a child and did not worry that tenderness might make the child weak. A craftsman sanded a table for one more minute than the invoice could justify. A tired official signed a document, then crossed out a clause that would have satisfied a petty cruelty and wrote another that would endure. The day without making an announcement raised its standards by a degree. In the palace beyond space, Wis watched a new arithmetic stabilize and found it beautiful. Beerus recognized competence when he tasted it and permitted himself a thin smile that resembled relief and preferred not to be seen. The chamber loosened, satisfied. Goku lowered his arm and let the white gold recede until it lay just under the skin like a promise neither threatened nor bragged. He felt no hunger to test the form against an enemy. He felt instead the quiet rightness of having been placed correctly in a machine that functions best when no one boasts that they built it. You used to carry everything, he said. Maybe you don't have to carry this. The Emperor allowed the suggestion to stand where a command might once have shoved. I am learning the difference between abandonment and trust. Feels better, doesn't it? It feels truer. The crucible dissolved back into openness. The constellations that had behaved like sentences returned to behaving like stars. The paths remained, but they no longer demanded to be walked. They waited with the courtesy of good roads. A thin tremor brushed the brink of reality, an inquisitive pressure the way a storm tests a window. The Emperor did not tighten. He did not sharpen the light into spears. He extended attention instead, right and even, until there was nowhere for the tremor to find purchase. The pressure faded, bored by the absence of panic. Goku watched the non-event and nodded as if a sparring partner had finally stopped dropping his hand after the second feint. You'll be fine. I will be better, the presence allowed, and then as if discovering the form of blessing after centuries of using only orders, so will you. He held out once more the intention shaped like mercy. It touched the center of Goku's chest again, and this time the contact left a trace, a small warmth that would not advertise itself. It was not authority installed. It was recognition formalized. In another world, priests might have called it anointing. In this one, it was simply a decision made at the correct depth. Act of faith. The present said not as theology, but as craft. Not mine alone, yours. Goku exhaled and the breath tasted like iron and sunlight in equal measure. The white gold flared once less like triumph than like gratitude, and then took its place within him as something to be spent carefully. He looked up as if there were a ceiling to look at. What now? Now the present said, I practice restraint until it graduates into trust. Goku grinned. I'll practice too. Practice what? Not needing to win. The chamber laughed without sound. It was not amusement at a joke. It was agreement with a method. Beyond them, the second sun drew no closer and moved no farther away. The blue world rolled under it, bearing markets and songs and ordinary tragedies that under a steadier light would hurt in ways that did not have to rot. The palace beyond space remained dignified and curious. The dark reconsidered its schedules and decided to hunt where noise would answer noise. The Emperor withdrew by a fraction, the way a craftsman steps back from a piece that is finely level. He did not vanish. He reduced his weight upon the world until only those who had learned to feel attention could feel him. That was enough. On earth, a river bent around a rock and did not grumble. In a school, a child who had once believed he could only learn by fear discovered he could learn by fascination. and kept the discovery secret for a while, as one does with precious things. In a hospital, a nurse wrote down the correct dosage a second time and caught the error before it mattered. The day kept adding such entries to its ledger until the ledger learned how to balance itself. Goku hovered longer than he needed to and then let the planet reel him back. He descended through stable light and honest air and touched ground with the softness of someone who had visited a library rather than a battlefield. The grass rose after his ankles and lay down again without complaint. He did not announce what had changed. He trained, and the training looked like anyone else's repetition, without complaint attention, without drama. The white gold within him showed no appetite for spectacle. It kept time, high above the vantage, watched without fixing. The lesson had taken. The universe did not require supervision to behave. It required respect to remember itself. The Emperor settled upon the throne in the way a mind settles inside its least destructive habit. He held the Astronomicon steady with less strain, as if a muscle long clenched had finally understood that rigidity is not the same as strength. In the gaps between necessities, he let the new law rewrite its clause power that remembers its purpose need not own its outcomes. He allowed the thought a final shape, trust his order practiced from the inside. The second sun did not answer, because truths rarely do. It abided. The sky learned its continuity. The world went on with its million honest tasks. And between two realities, a vow much older than language completed itself without ceremony. Light that refuses to dominate becomes guidance. The gods had always believed themselves to be the highest fact a universe could state about itself. They administered cycles, kept the ledgers of creation neat, and trimmed excess with the confidence of gardeners who never doubted the garden. Then the second sun taught the sky to keep still without orders, and the ledgers began to look like minutes taken at a meeting the world no longer attended. Psyche, the braided patience of will and instinct, did not arrive as a proclamation. It moved through the living the way understanding moves through a room. After a hard truth is spoken kindly. The strong felt their power take a breath. The ordinary discovered that attention, when practiced correctly, was a tool that made other tools honest. In the halls that were not halls, the palace that ruled everything remeasured itself. Polished floors kept their shine, but the shine now looked like courtesy rather than intimidation. Attendants walked as though the air had grown slightly more sacred and slightly less impressed. The grand priest stood at the balcony, where no wind had ever been permitted, and allowed the idea of a breeze to lift the edges of his composure. He looked out across the stacked geometries of authority and let arithmetic humble him. Power had never been a problem numbers could not help him understand. Yet here was an equation he knew in his bones and could not write down. When a universe remembers itself from the inside, hierarchy resembles scaffolding useful while building undignified when left standing. Behind him, Zeno watched the distant gold with the bright concentration of a child who was deciding whether to put a new toy back where he found it. He had learned something about borders and had not broken from the lesson. The palace had slept without erasing anything. The result was not chaos. It was precision improved by mercy, which remained very still, which for him meant he permitted wonder to complete its commute from heart to face. He had expected the new arithmetic to wobble as innovations do before they discover their weight. Instead, it steadied. He considered the sentence he had hidden in his private scripture and discovered it had copied itself across the margins. Power that refuses possession becomes light. Beerus, who respected hunger more than most philosophies, discovered he was not in the mood to destroy anything. He tasted the air for the copper of crisis, found no blood. and then reluctantly admitted satisfaction. Gods do not need to be useful every hour of eternity. Sometimes they only need to stay out of the way. Below, on the blue world, Psyche behaved like competent weather. It carried no banners and filed no manifestos. A farmer touched the handle of a plow and felt the day agree to be worked. A soldier woke from a nightmare and found the part of himself that had wanted to keep the nightmare alive for company had learned better manners. A judge read a law that used to flatter cruelty and marked it for revision without ceremony. Across cities, strangers helped each other for reasons that did not require adjectives. Goku trained without spectacle. The white gold tucked just beneath his skin kept time. He moved through drills as if rehearsal had finally been permitted to be a kind of prayer. The new balance did not make him stronger the way tournaments measured strength. It made him exact. His punches carried no threat to the world that received them. They carried instruction. He found his appetite changing. Winning had always been a joy. Now, accuracy began to rival it. Vegeta discovered that pride, when relieved of panic, could serve as spine rather than mask. He practiced until the body delivered results that did not feel borrowed from rage. In the quiet after training, he looked at his hands and recognized them as tools that had earned their precision. The yard held him without temptation to boast. He let it. The Emperor watched and did not intervene. He maintained the golden vantage with the delicacy of a craftsman who has learned the virtue of negative space. The Astronomicon in his own universe continued to burn with less strain. The choir's agony lessened by a width too small for ceremony. He refused to take the improvement as proof that he had been correct all along. He allowed it to arrive as proof that restraint was a form of competence he had neglected. Across the border of realities, faint attentions tested the edge of the new order. Chaos had long memorized the taste of fear and the perverse sweetness of worship. Here it found a diet it did not prefer as steadiness, consent, and the kind of hope that does not get drunk on itself. It pressed for a moment, found no purchase, and withdrew as hunters withdraw from gardens where fences are well kept and fruit is not yet ripe. The Grand Priest descended the long corridor toward the central chamber and did not hurry. He did not need to. He arrived where Zeno sat among toys that were not toys and worlds that were not maps. He bowed by the small degree that honors seriousness without inviting drama. Majesty, he said, and the word sounded less like protocol than like gratitude. Order has encountered something that does not compete with it. Zeno blinked. It stays, it abides. The Grand Priest replied, it does not claim the right to remain. It merely does not require permission to continue. Zeno considered this without annoyance. He had learned recently that limits were not insults. They were shapes a wise being could use to know where to place his hands. He looked at the distant gold and did nothing which in him had become a remarkable action. Was joined them, staff balanced lightly between finger and thumb. The world corrects itself, he said softly. Not by rebellion, by recollection. Beerus settled against a pillar and did not posture. If it keeps mortals from inventing new disasters, I won't complain. His tail flicked once, betraying interest he would not name. The Grand Priest allowed himself the curiosity of a mortal for a single sentence. We are sustained by attention, he said. How different are we from the thing that now watches without owning? No one answered aloud. The question did not require courage so much as good manners. It moved through the palace like a scent and changed nothing that could be seen while mending much that mattered. On Earth, the day took inventory. A schoolroom did not erupt in cruelty at the first opportunity. A marketplace tolerated fewer lies. An old man forgave a debt and discovered he could afford the gesture. None of this was news. All of it was durable. Goku visited the Vantage not because the light demanded it, but because attendance at good conversations is itself a virtue. He entered as one steps into a library whose shelves have learned to trust their own weight. The Chamber of Gold did not dramatize his arrival. It brightened by an amount only scholars of kindness notice. He hovered there, letting the attention that filled the place teach him how to breathe correctly. The presence met him with the quiet of a craftsman who has decided to use smaller tools. "You're still here," Goku said. "I am less here," the presence answered. "That is the improvement." He nodded. "People are changing, not a lot. Just enough. Just enough is how civilizations endure," came the reply. They did not move to spar. They did not trade tests. The conversation had shed the need for proof. Goku asked a question he had not known he wanted to ask until the quiet drew it out of him. "Do gods get tired of being gods?" "Some do," the presence said. "Some never notice they are tired. I am learning to call fatigue by its correct name, grief. Grief for what? For the things I prevented so thoroughly that they never had the chance to exist." Goku looked down at the blue world, turning like a patient coin. "You could fix everything, couldn't you? I can keep a light burning. Fixing is a different craft. You're not going to try. I am going to trust." They let the exchange end where it wanted to end. The chamber loosened, satisfied, and returned to watchfulness that did not crowd. In the palace beyond space, Zeno stood. The court quieted in the manner of fields when the wind changes direction. He walked to the knot window and regarded the second sun, then lowered his eyes to the planet that had learned to be steady without asking permission. He raised a hand because gesture matters when teaching one's self-respect. The hand did not flicker with erasure. It traced gently a boundary in the air, a reminder to authority of where authority becomes stewardship. The Grand Priest bowed deeper than the degree required. Whis smiled as if someone had told the right joke at the correct table. Beerus pretended to yawn and failed. The boundary held because it did not need to be defended. Laws that have found humility do not need guards. Psyche intensified by forgetting to boast. In villages, elders began to tell stories differently, fewer heroic last stands, more patient repairs. In cities, small decencies accumulated like interest that would one day buy something important. The strong did not stop being strong. They stopped using strength to audition for attention they no longer needed. The emperor considered the distance between attention and command and refused again to cross it. He sat within his dying body like a king who has learned the etiquette of borrowed rooms. The Astronomicon burned with the steadiness of a vow that no longer shakes the hand that made it. Around him, the machinery that drank psychers and converted them into direction continued its brutal arithmetic. He did not soften its necessity with lies. He resolved, however, to measure necessity more often against the new law, trust his order practiced from the inside. He thought of his people with a tenderness he had previously disguised as severity. He allowed himself a sentence that would never be carved above a gate, but might still enter a million kitchens, let them learn to hold their own light. The moment called for a decision he had postponed since the first flicker of gold appeared above the foreign sea. He drew the projection inward until it became once again a vantage rather than a man. He let it thin at the edges where pride might have preferred thickness. He meant to remain. He meant to weigh less. "Are you leaving?" Goku asked, arriving as if he had been invited to ask. "I am planting," the presence said. "A lamp burns less brightly when it has taught a city how to make windows." Goku grinned. "So, You'll visit when needed, the presence answered. Not by schedule. By consent. From both sides, from both. He paused, then offered a sentence that understood the difference between blessing and command. Guard the form, not as prize, but as tool. The white gold beneath Goku's skin answered without flaring. It warmed, then settled as if a page had turned inside the body, and the text fit better. Goku inclined his head, which in him was a discipline. I will. He descended through honest air toward a world that no longer required spectacle to be good. He did not gather followers or write rules. He taught a boy how to stand correctly, and a woman how to breathe through the 5th repetition when the 4th would have been easier to quit. He ate dinner. He slept without dreaming of enemies. The day made a ledger entry on his behalf, precision kept. Vegeta, crossing the yard at dusk, felt the world slip into gear. He practiced a form he had always hurried through and discovered why he had always been slightly wrong. He corrected it and did not announce the correction to anyone. That is how pride grows up. The palace beyond space dimmed its lights by a fraction for no reason that could be defended in a council. Zeno hummed a tune that did not exist and liked it. The grand priest adjusted a robe that had never wrinkled and found to his quiet delight that it now wrinkled where deference should be. Whis poured tea and missed the cup by a whisper, then caught the spill with a gesture too elegant to be noticed by anyone except himself. Beerus slept with the lengthened calm of a predator who knows the herd will not stampede tonight. Chaos revised its calendar and moved on. The emperor, whose titles could fill ruins, allowed one line to stand, where the old titles had competed steward, not owner. He turned his attention toward the furnace of his own realm and carried into it the patience he had learned in another sky. The act did not save anyone yet. It made saving possible later, without the cost of worship. He would try for that. At last, when the universe had finished, not needing him for the evening, he shaped a single thought along the bridge that connected realities, not a command, not even counsel, only a promise scaled to the humility he had earned. I will not end, he said into the quiet that now knew how to keep quiet. I will set other lamps. The second sun accepted the vow without changing its brightness. The blue world beneath it kept doing a million honest things. In kitchens and fields and training yards, the new law continued to write itself in the grammar of hands. In palaces, authority practiced restraint until restraint became character. Between two realities, gods learned the arithmetic of respect. Night arrived precise and unafraid. The gold did not argue with it. Among the stars, a small region of existence remembered a lesson that had waited since the first light startled the first darkness into meaning. When power prefers guidance to possession, the cosmos keeps its balance without gritting its teeth. The year turned beneath a patient sun that did not belong to its arithmetic. Markets learned the new brightness and adjusted awnings. Children learned to nap with light on their faces and called it summer, regardless of season. The second sun had become a fact, and facts, when they are generous, begin to instruct without speaking. What the world had called miracle resolved into infrastructure. Psychi discipline braided with instinct moved through the living like a law courts refused to codify because it would be an insult to write down what decency already knows. No trumpet claimed it. No scripture advertised it. Yet tools improved in hands that had been clumsy a year before, and quarrels remembered their actual cause before inventing a new one. The first shape of what people later learned to call Imperium Kai began where most institutions worth trusting begin in a room too small to intimidate among people too busy to pose. There were no robes. There was no architecture aspiring to heaven by embarrassing earth. There were benches plain and uneven. The maps on the walls were not sacred. they were useful. A farmer sat beside a fighter, a schoolteacher beside an engineer, an old woman who had never traveled more than 20 miles from her village beside a pilot whose bones carried the thin ache of altitude. They had not gathered to be told what to do. They had come to compare how they had already begun doing it. They shared methods the way neighbors share salt, how to breathe through a fifth repetition when the fourth had almost broken you, where to place your attention when the heart tries to impersonate a riot, how to teach a child to hear their own strength as instruction rather than threat. The word order appeared less often than the word practice. Someone asked about gods. The room considered the question as if it were a tool whose handle might be hot. A woman who repaired bridges for a living answered first without meaning to. If they are doing their jobs, she said, they won't mind us doing ours. Goku arrived late and alone, carrying no title. He took a seat in the back and listened with the kind of attention he had learned to respect. He spoke only once, and not to offer doctrine. Stand like the thing you love is behind you, he said. You'll move better. The room tried it without argument. Bodies shifted. The air improved. He left before anyone could ask him to bless anything. Vegeta didn't come to that first meeting. Instead, he walked his yard, measuring it against standards the day had raised. Pride, released from its old job of proving existence, had become spine. He used it to build something that could stand outside him when he was gone. He did not give it a name. Others did and were careful. They called it a school and meant it. No banners, no pledges, a door that did not lock, and a field that refused spectacle. Students arrived and discovered there were no grades, only accuracy. Elsewhere, other rooms opened. No central authority permitted it. No central authority could have stopped it. Imperium Kai did not begin as a church or an army. It began as the quiet decision to behave, as if the light above were a reminder rather than a boss. People taught each other how to keep the promise of their hands. The emblem, when it appeared, was not worship. It was a tool mark, a narrow circle with a line through it, signifying a lamp seen from the side. Gods noticed and tolerated. Whis watched the new arithmetic move without wobble and let the staff rest against his shoulder, as if even instruments enjoy a day off. Beerus prowled the edges of his appetite and discovered fewer excuses to be useful in his usual way. He did not complain with his usual vigor. If mortals insist on making fewer messes, he said, and did not finish the sentence because finishing it would have sounded like praise. Zeno learned what restraint feels like when practiced on purpose rather than out of boredom. He stood at the knot window the palace had learned to admit, and traced with a finger that could have unmade continents the boundary he had chosen not to cross. It did not resist his touch. Borders that are honored rarely do. The Grand Priest tested the new balance by pushing lightly in places where systems fail, when they are merely fashionable. He found no fashion to punish. The correction held. He allowed himself privately to be relieved. The Emperor watched and allowed attention to stand where command would once have marched. On Terra, the Astronomicon kept burning with the steadiness of a vow that has finally learned not to grind its maker's teeth. The choir screamed less often, and when they did, they screamed together, which made the burden legible. He did not take comfort as license. He took it as instruction. More weight belongs upon the patience he had acquired than upon the instincts he had perfected. He did not withdraw entirely. A vantage remained over the blue world. Gold thinned to courtesy. He let the light speak in the dialect of roads. Lamps are a species of road. They do not carry anyone. They clarify where carrying would insult. Imperium Kai, still pretending it was only a set of good habits, began to develop customs. They were shy and refused to be called virtues. A habit emerged of beginning a meeting with a single minute of literal silence. Not because silence is holy, but because it cleans instruments. A practice developed of asking 3 questions before offering 1 answer. When ceremonies threatened to grow, the rooms remembered they were rooms and knocked on their own walls to prove it. There were failures. Any law that expects none insults those who intend to obey it. A young man tried to turn psyche into a technique for being obeyed. He failed spectacularly and quietly both at once. His students learned something his syllabus had not planned to teach. A council in a city by the sea attempted to register all the rooms as if good work required certificates to breathe. The rooms held their minutes of silence and continued to meet. The council changed its mind without embarrassment. That is a kind of victory worth more than a parade. Trouble arrived in honest clothing. A drought with no villain. A disease that refused drama. A ship trapped in orbit by a mechanical error that obeyed none of the laws the new light had taught. Imperium Kai did not solve these with miracles. It solved them with competence and a refusal to panic. Rivers were managed with intelligence and without theft. Hospitals changed their rounding protocols because nurses knew the work better than the administrators who were suddenly willing to listen. The ship returned to atmosphere because a pilot relearned patience in the 5th minute of a checklist that had formerly bored him. News spread because news loves improvements it can verify. What spread faster beneath headlines and above rumor was the relief that arrives when the world remembers it is allowed to be adequate. Goku trained as if he were a craftsman with a backlog rather than a hero with a destiny. The white gold beneath the skin kept time and refused to show off. Some afternoons he visited a room and stood where the benches were worst so the good wood could be used by those who needed it more. He answered questions that could be answered and refused the ones that needed to be practiced. Should I trust power, someone asked him one maskanasnes. Not until it behaves, he said. Where do I put my fear, a boy asked him in a voice that had learned to be brave before it had learned to be honest. In the same room as your attention, he said. Make them work together. Are you in charge of this? A reporter asked at a table pretending to be a desk. No, he said, sympathetic to the hunger the question betrayed. That's why it works. Vegeta, inside a late hour and a quiet yard, created a sequence of movements so exact it left no room for despair to breed between the steps. He taught it to a handful of people and then taught them how to teach it without teaching pride. He had never thought of himself as patient. He discovered that patience was not kind. It was exact. The emblem began to appear carved into the edges of workbenches and burned discreetly into the grips of tools. It did not hang over doors. Lamps belong near darkness, not above it. Children traced the line and circle on their notebooks and learned how to make straight lines with tired hands. The symbol accrued no cash value and therefore remained useful. Whis tasted tea and found for the first time in an age that it tasted exactly like tea. Beerus woke one afternoon to discover he had slept without guarding anything. He considered correction and chose to roll over. Zino watched the world without touching it and did not bruise from restraint. Chaos, faithful to its own economy, visited rarely. When it did, it found a diet of calm that offered few calories. It left messages scratched on the underside of the universe, where boredom reads them later. The Emperor measured his own restraint with the severity he once reserved for the courage of soldiers. He found there was a courage more dangerous to him than any charge into fire, the courage to watch the living, do the work he had believed only he could do, and to bless them by not interrupting. He gave himself no congratulations for learning it. He placed the lesson in a room he had vacated to make space for it and locked nothing. A girl in a river city taught herself to balance on a narrow board with a jug of water on her head, and then taught everyone else because it made their mornings shorter. A worker in a factory discovered a way to listen to a machine until it confessed what part was tired. The part was replaced before it failed. The foreman thought of writing a memo and instead walked the floor and thanked people by their names, which turned out to be a better memo. A thief chose a different craft. A bully stopped mid-gesture and forgot the sentence he had been rehearsing for years. A legislator resigned without scandal because he had done what he could and understood the new law better than most competence includes the ability to leave. Rooms multiplied, and none were called headquarters. Imperium Kai stayed allergic to monuments. Someone tried to donate a statue. The rooms thanked the donor and asked for chairs. The donor learned what gratitude feels like when it refuses to flatter. There were still fights. Power does not retire. It reassigns. 2 districts argued over water, and the argument wore the usual costumes until a woman who had never left either district carried a bucket to the border and set it down. She began dipping water from one side into the other in a rhythm a musician would have called correct. No one saw the moment the argument became choreography, but when it ended, no one remembered to be proud of ending it. In the palace, the grand priest wrote a sentence he would never speak into a ledger that recorded nothing. Authority is a posture perfected by refusing to lean. He closed the book and permitted it to exist as an object instead of as a doctrine. Zeno played with a toy that refused to break by design and discovered he liked toys that survived him. Was watched the boundary he and his lord had drawn hold because it no longer required holding. Beerus devised a new nap and practiced it. The second year, Under the Steady Gold brought a test that did not feel like a test because it arrived as bureaucracy. A distant administration proposed a registry for Sekai practitioners. The rationale was safety. The appetite behind it was fear of being left out. Rooms held their minutes of silence and returned to the work. The registry withered, as appetite does, when it cannot find flattery. Goku stood one morning at the edge of a cliff that remembered thunder and watched the world behave. He thought of what the Emperor had said about lamps and windows. He imagined a city that did not confuse brightness with virtue. He smiled without proof. A voice arrived with the softness of a decision returning for its receipt. You have kept the form honest. He did not turn. We built it small. That is why it fits. Goku let the quiet sit between them like a third participant. Are you leaving? I am weighing less, the presence said. That is not the same thing. Do you need anything? Only this. The presence said, and the request knew the difference between blessing and burden. Guard your attention as fiercely as you guarded your speed. I can do that. Teach others to do it without using my name. Already did. The conversation ended where good work ends without applause. The light above remained exactly as it had been a minute before. That is how vows prefer to register. On Terra, the Emperor adjusted nothing except himself. He learned to schedule his cruelty against necessity rather than against impatience. He permitted the choir to rest when rest did not break ships. He did not explain these mercies to anyone. He doubted mercy that requires witnesses to justify itself. He imagined briefly, and without the sin of planning a day, when his people might no longer require the throne to prevent their collapse. He did not yearn for the day. Yearning breeds negligence. He simply allowed the picture to exist and then put it away, like a letter meant to be opened by someone else. Imperium Kai did not crown leaders. It crowned moments. A street vendor gave change twice to a man who had been short once, and the second crown settled on both their heads. A teacher threw out a lesson plan because the room had brought a better one. A runner stopped to walk with someone who needed the finish more than the time. Coronations without gold accumulated until the city remembered that worth is a form of math anyone can learn. A boy in a room asked Goku a question that felt like throwing a rock into a well and waiting for the sound. "What's the point?" He answered without rushing. "To be accurate with kindness." Another asked him if Imperium Kai would last. He looked around the little room, the bad benches, the good maps, the faces that had come from work instead of leaving it to be there, and said, "If it gets too proud, no. If it keeps doing the small things, yes." Vegeta, walking past his students, overheard someone refer to him with reverence and cut the word in half with a look. "Respect is cheap," he said. "Bring exactness." The emblem appeared carved into the haft of a shovel and on the underside of a stool where no one would see it unless they repaired the stool. It never learned to like flags. It never learned to enjoy speeches. It kept dignities small. The palace's nights became quieter. Zeno dreamed at a human scale and woke amused rather than hungry. The Grand Priest found that the sentence he had written for his private ledger no longer needed to be guarded. It had left the book as practice leaves a page to become a hand. Beerus was bored less often and realized that boredom does not obligate destruction. Was learned a new recipe for a simple soup and enjoyed making it without inventing symbolism. Chaos marked the sector as unprofitable. It would return someday because that is what it does. The garden grew anyway. When the anniversary of the day the second sun first appeared arrived, no one saw it arrive because the world had stopped counting anniversaries for events that had chosen to be normal. Goku trained. Vegeta corrected a stance he had already corrected. A nurse slept between shifts and woke without dread. The river chose a slower bank for its flood and recommended patience to its fish. In a room in a city by the sea, people sat on benches and told the truth about the week. High above in the space where intention survives erasure, the Emperor allowed a thought to cross the careful bridge. It carried no command, and only the authority humility can afford. "I will set other lamps." The words did not affect the light. The light had already been what the words promised. The vow affected him. It changed the temperature of his resolve by a degree that would matter when the century turned a harder corner. He did not leave. He weighed less. He kept the Astronomicon burning with the smallest strength capable of doing the job well, the way good hands lift a child firm enough, not more. He placed trust where command had stood and watched command become available for what required it instead of spending itself on what merely feared boredom. On the blue world rooms kept meeting. The emblem kept hiding in plain sight. People began to speak of Imperium Kai with a tone usually reserved for tools that don't break when you need them. The phrase "the second sun" remained, but more often than before, it meant a manner, rather than a phenomenon, the way a person can brighten a room without making anyone squint. Evening settled. Lamps lit in windows that had learned how to welcome them. A woman crossed a street carrying a bucket with the kind of balance that makes the watching child want to imitate her for reasons that have nothing to do with glory. A boy set down a toy gently because he had learned to like things that survive being loved. A man wrote a letter of resignation and a thank you note on the same page. The day filed its ledger. Accuracy kept kindness spent, balance maintained. Goku stood once more at the cliff's edge because cliffs make conversation honest. The wind used his shoulders as an argument that had already been won. He did not ask the sky for permission to keep going. He did not promise it anything elaborate in return. He let the white gold beneath the skin keep time and trusted the hour it reported. Behind him, the world made the small noises of a civilization that has learned not to shout. Ahead of him, the horizon accepted his stare and returned it without trying to win. Above him, a sun that did not heat refused to leave. Beside that refusal, stars kept their appointments. He spoke once because speech sometimes completes a thought that silence has prepared. "We'll keep it small," he said. The light answered by remaining exactly what it was. Night arrived. As if it had been invited, the second sun declined to argue. Together, they made a sky that asked nothing of anyone except that each keep to their work with the respect the work deserved. In kitchens and fields and yards and palaces, the new law continued to write itself line by patient line in handwriting, tidy enough to teach and messy enough to be human power that remembers its purpose, prefers guidance to possession. Order practiced from the inside does not need a guard. The chapter closed without ceremony because the work did not.